Ever wondered about medieval sex being romantic? Brace yourself because it was less romance and more rampant fleas. In this video, you'll virtually sink into a peasant's straw bed, experience the awkward quiet of arranged unions, catch a whiff of the bittersweet aroma of medieval brothels, and discover that even amidst guilt, fear, and strict societal norms, desire always found a way to surface. A raw and uncomfortably honest look at love, pleasure, restraint, and defiance during one of history's most misunderstood eras. You've probably imagined it at least once. A flickering candle. A stone chamber warmed by firelight. Some sort of knight who's just come in from battle, covered in sweat and moral ambiguity, undressing with a casual smirk. There's velvet involved. Maybe silk sheets. Maybe a goblet of wine. Maybe you're wearing one of those gowns that falls off the shoulder if someone breathes too hard. Yeah. That's not what happened. Because in the actual Middle Ages, real, drafty, awkward, church-regulated medieval life, sex wasn't a fantasy. It was a logistical nightmare sandwiched between livestock, gossip, bad plumbing, and someone's second cousin coughing in the corner bedroll. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't private. And it definitely wasn't something you whispered about unless you wanted a priest to start fasting on your behalf. And now, you're going to live it. Tonight's story doesn't start with love. It starts with obligation, expectations, and a mattress stuffed with hay and regret. You've been married off, the servants are watching, and your husband is now your spiritual partner, your financial overseer, and your assigned sex companion, all in one convenient, mildly judgmental package. So pull the curtains around your shared bed, if you're lucky enough to have them, brace yourself for the eye contact from your maid, and try not to think too hard about what you're allowed to do according to canon law. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, welcome. You're in the right place. Let's just say this up front. If you were hoping for a little alone time, in your chamber, in your marriage, in your own underwear, medieval architecture is not your friend. It's sometime in the 14th century. You live in a castle. Sounds romantic, right? Except it's not the Disney kind with turreted towers and thick velvet curtains drawn over private bedrooms. This is a practical, noisy, overcrowded stone fortress that was built to keep enemies out, and, apparently, intimacy too. You wake up in a room that doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to the household. The bed might be yours, technically, but the room? Shared. You share it with your servants. With visiting relatives. With your kids. With their nurse. Sometimes with your cousin's kid, who just happens to be passing through and needs a place to sleep. It's communal living with just enough distance to pretend it isn't weird. Doors, if you have one, don't lock. Not because you lost the key, but because they were never designed to. Locks were for treasure chests, not bedrooms. You want privacy? Good luck. Your bedroom door is more like a suggestion, a gentle reminder that you might be doing something you don't want announced at breakfast. Even if the door is closed, it won't matter. Stone walls echo, and the floors creak like they're auditioning for a ghost story. If someone passes by, they'll hear everything. And they'll definitely tell someone about it, either over morning bread or while pouring wine at dinner. You think maybe the servants give you space? Absolutely not. They're assigned to the room. It's part of their job. If you're a noble, your personal attendants are always nearby, sometimes sleeping on straw pallets near the hearth, sometimes curled up under the same blanket at the foot of the bed. They light your fire. They trim your candles. They refill your wash basin with lukewarm goat-scented water at dawn. And they're still folding your shift while your husband is trying to fold you into the mattress. There's no do not disturb sign. No understanding that intimacy might require some kind of emotional buffer. The expectation is that you will simply do what needs doing, quietly, efficiently, and preferably before the next meal. And it's not just your chamber. The entire castle is a circus of shared space. Servants live above you, beside you, below you. The steward passes through hallways with ledges. The chaplain pretends not to notice things. The cook knows exactly how long you stayed in bed, based solely on whether you ordered broth or bread that morning. Now imagine you're poor. No castle, no door, and definitely no room to call your own. You're living in a one-room cottage with a thatched roof and a family of 6. The animals sleep inside for warmth. The in-laws might live next door or, worse, with you. And if you're married, sex happens after the children are asleep, which means you become an expert in timing, silence, and the art of keeping a straight face while your toddler rolls over 6 inches away. In towns and villages, inns offer shared beds for travelers. Not rooms. Beds. As in, here's a straw mattress, and here's a stranger to share it with. Don't worry, he only coughs at night. Travelers would literally bunk next to people they didn't know, a tradition so common, it was considered rude not to make room for one more body. And if you're unmarried? Congratulations, your options are even worse. If you want intimacy, you need either a secluded barn, a very cooperative cousin, or the kind of village gossip immunity that requires decades of reputation management. Because in towns with 1 bathhouse, 2 wells, and 0 secrets, everyone knows everything, including what happened behind the alehouse last Sunday. Monasteries and convents tried to avoid all this mess by building massive garden walls and organizing men and women into segregated zones of silence and Latin chanting. But even there, private space was a myth. Monks slept side by side in long rows of wooden cots, forbidden to speak, but fully within elbow distance. Nuns, too, had constant supervision, just in case someone got too inspired by the Virgin Mary and wandered into a scandal. Privacy, in short, was a luxury no one really had. And even if you managed to carve out a private moment, someone would eventually knock, enter without permission, or shout your name from the hallway because someone forgot how many eggs they were supposed to boil. So you learn to live like a public figure in a house made of whispers. You edit your sighs. You quiet your footsteps. You make peace with the idea that nothing truly intimate is ever truly unseen. In the medieval world, privacy isn't just rare, it's suspicious. If you close a door, people assume you're hiding something. If you bolt it, they assume it's sex. And if you enjoy it, well, now you've got 2 sins to confess on Sunday. And no, the confessional doesn't have a door either. Let's talk about your bed. Or rather, let's talk about the idea that it's your bed. Because in the medieval world, ownership of a bed is a fluid concept. You might sleep in it most nights, but that doesn't mean you get to decide who else joins. In fact, your bed is less of a personal sanctuary and more of a heavily used multi-purpose platform, equal parts sleeping space, social seating, child containment zone, and regrettably, sometimes a place for sex. Tonight, you're lying on the left side. On the right? Your husband. Somewhere near your feet? A child. Not necessarily yours. Just a child. Could be a niece. Could be a visiting relative. Could be a servant you're training. Could be someone you accidentally inherited when their parents died of dysentery. Either way, they're here. And they're kicking in their sleep. Directly beside the bed, on a narrow bundle of blankets, is your lady's maid. Or if you're less wealthy, it's your sister. Or your mother-in-law. Or your neighbor who's staying the night because wolves were spotted on the road and it's just not safe to walk home in the dark. Privacy isn't just scarce. It's practically extinct. And that whole idea of a bedroom being sacred space? That's adorable. Medieval sleeping arrangements were practical, crowded, and optimized for body heat. If someone needed shelter, they shared your bed. If someone needed a conversation, they had it across your bed. And if someone needed to give birth, die, or recover from the plague, guess where that happened? That's right. Your bed. Hope you like company. You've probably already figured out that sexual intimacy in this context is less passionate embrace, and more don't wake the toddler. Because odds are, someone else is snoring 2 feet away. Or coughing. Or rustling under a pile of fur blankets while pretending very hard not to listen. Medieval marriage manuals didn't exactly give tips for this situation. They assumed you had a bed and a partner and a priest's blessing, not a co-sleeping arrangement that involved half the household and the family dog. But the logistics of medieval sex rarely matched the ideals. There were no marriage suites. Just space, bodies, and luck. Even among the wealthy, rooms were rarely private. Servants often slept on trundle beds that pulled out from beneath yours, which meant any midnight activity had an audience, however drowsy. And if you were especially lucky, your bed was in an alcove, separated from the rest of the room by a curtain that billowed dramatically when anyone coughed too hard. In poor households, things were even more intimate. One-room cottages, shared blankets, and straw mattresses flattened from decades of use. You didn't just hear your parents having sex, you probably made eye contact at some point and had to pretend you didn't. If you were newly married, your first night might involve borrowing a neighbor's bed, ideally after they'd changed the linens, though this was not guaranteed. Even inns and boarding houses followed the communal rule. Travelers often paid for a spot in a bed, not the bed itself. 2 or 3 people might be squeezed into the same straw mattress, strangers until that night, now unwilling witnesses to each other's sleep habits. There are actual records of men complaining about their bedmates snoring, twitching, or conversational flatulence. Romantic. Now, if you're thinking okay, but surely the upper classes had better arrangements, they did. Sort of. Rich nobles could afford larger beds. Which meant you could still have 3 people in the room, but now with more legroom. You might even have the luxury of sleeping behind a screen. But the presence of servants, attendants, scribes, or family members remained. You weren't alone. You were important. Which meant your body, your schedule, and yes, your bedroom, belonged to the household. So you adapted. You learned to time things between servants' rotations. You waited until the co-sleeping child finally drifted off. You trained yourself to ignore the dog licking its paws under the blanket. And most of all, you never forgot that whatever happened in that bed would probably be talked about in the morning. Because communal beds came with communal memory. The creak of a frame. The rustle of straw. The muffled sound of movement in the dark. These weren't private sensations. They were public facts. And in a world where gossip moved faster than fire and reputations were made in whispers, your bed was just another place to be seen, even when you were supposed to be hidden. You learned to hold your breath. To move quietly. To smile politely at breakfast and pretend no one noticed anything. Because medieval guilt wasn't just spiritual. It was spatial. And the bed you shared with your husband? You also shared it with the silence that followed. By now, you've accepted that there is no such thing as privacy, not in bed, not in public, and definitely not in marriage. But what no one prepared you for is just how public even the most private parts of your life will become. It's not that people occasionally stumble across your secrets. It's that the entire system is built to ensure someone is always watching. Or listening. Or, most often, whispering. You might think marriage is a union between 2 people. In the medieval world, it's more of a community project. Everyone's got an opinion, and no one is shy about sharing it, especially the people who technically work for you. Your chambermaid sees everything, from the way your husband removes his hose to how long he lingers after the candle's been blown out. Your steward knows what time you went to bed and whether the kitchen staff was asked to bring broth in the morning, a detail that, somehow, always makes its way into the laundry room gossip circuit. And if your husband happens to be a lord, noble, or anyone with even a modest title, you can be certain that half the castle staff is already placing bets on whether or not you'll be pregnant by the next full moon. Sex isn't private. It's part of your duties. And in many households, it's a matter of record. There are women whose entire job is to note your cycles, chart your appetite, and casually mention to the housekeeper when your linens need changing more frequently than usual. They won't say it outright, of course. They'll just lift an eyebrow and nod slowly, as if what they're not saying is some kind of divine revelation. But it's not just servants. Family members are often the worst offenders. Your mother-in-law lives 2 doors down and considers herself a spiritual advisor with a minor in reproduction. Your sister drops in unannounced with advice wrapped in moral superiority. And your priest? Oh, he knows everything. Not because you told him, but because your confessor is also your neighbor's cousin's uncle and he has excellent hearing through stone walls. And don't forget the midwives. They are the true intelligence officers of the medieval world. They know which girls are late, which wives are disappointed, and which noble husbands haven't managed to produce an heir despite 3 consecutive bedding ceremonies and a rotating cast of hopeful prayer candles. If your midwife is quiet, it's not because she doesn't know. It's because she's saving the good stories for the winter market stalls, when gossip freezes slower and lasts longer. Even court records get involved. There are actual legal proceedings from the time in which someone's fertility, or failure to deliver it, becomes a matter for church court. In one infamous case, a couple was ordered to have sex in front of witnesses to prove consummation. Yes, witnesses. Plural. And yes, they were given tips. Try again, but with more vigor. You can't make this up. And while it might seem like only nobles were this exposed, peasants had their own village version of the surveillance state. Neighbors lived so close you could hear every sneeze. Windows were for airflow, not secrecy. And if someone slipped out of a cottage at midnight, the entire hamlet would know by morning. There were no secrets, just delayed announcements. Even gestures became suspicious. A man lingered too long by the well? That's an affair. A woman laughed too brightly at the tanner's joke? She's ruining her husband's name. 2 people were seen walking alone after dusk? Scandal, excommunication, or worse, a poem might be written. And this, of course, leads us to the sport of choice in medieval communities, gossip. Not the harmless kind. The weaponized kind. People didn't just pass the time with stories, they constructed reputations out of crumbs and ashes. A single slip, an accidental noise, a misplaced glance, and suddenly you're the subject of 7 prayers, 5 rumors, and a suspicious increase in candle donations on your behalf. You learn, quickly, to monitor your own expressions. To speak softly. To never make a joke about not sleeping well. Because someone, somewhere, will decide it means something else entirely. In a world without locks, where words were currency and silence could still betray you, sex wasn't just about the act, it was about the management of perception. The control of narrative. The constant, exhausting pressure to appear holy, healthy, and just intimate enough to keep the inheritance line moving, but never so intimate that anyone gets uncomfortable. It's not that you're paranoid. It's that you're paying attention. Because in this world, even if no one sees you, they see through you. And then they talk about it while peeling onions in the kitchen. You've survived the wedding. Congratulations. You've walked down the aisle, or something approximating it, depending on whether you got married in a cathedral, a barn, or your father's sheep paddock. And now everyone's had a little bread, a lot of ale, and just enough religious ceremony to pretend this whole thing wasn't arranged 4 months ago over a goat and a parcel of muddy land. You're tired. Your new spouse is someone you've known for 3 weeks. You've never seen them without a hat. And now? Now it's time for the part that everyone has been waiting for, the one that involves fewer vows and more witnesses. Welcome to the medieval bedding ceremony. Here's how it works. You and your new spouse are led, paraded, really, to the marriage bed. This isn't a private moment. This is a procession. Think torches, music, tipsy uncles, that one drunk priest who always makes things weird, and half the town's population trailing behind you like it's a pilgrimage. There's laughter. There are songs. There might be a lute. Once inside the chamber, you don't close the door. That would be suspicious. Instead, a crowd files in to witness what medieval custom considers the true sealing of the union, the moment when 2 legal strangers are supposed to become one flesh, preferably while everyone else hovers nearby offering commentary, advice, or trying not to spill wine on the bedding. Your attendants, and by attendants we mean your very chatty cousins and your new mother-in-law, help undress you. Not just symbolically. Literally. This is part of the ceremony. Your outer garments are removed by helpful hands while people murmur encouraging phrases like, "Be fruitful," and "Time to earn that dowry." Meanwhile, your new spouse is being similarly unwrapped like a nervous Christmas gift across the room. If you're noble, this might happen on a raised platform, just so everyone can see. If you're lucky, the crowd will leave before the actual consummation. But this is not guaranteed. Some traditions required a witness, or several, to stay in the room until there was audible evidence that the marriage had been physically sealed. Some even demanded that someone check the bedsheets the next morning for signs of virginity lost, a practice that assumes blood is a consistent and universal indicator, which it very much is not. But when has science ever gotten in the way of a good medieval ritual? Now imagine this entire experience from your perspective, second person. Remember? You've just had your hair braided by someone who smells like onion soup. You're wearing a shift that fits awkwardly and feels like a tablecloth. You're being watched by half your family and all your in-laws. And you're about to have sex with someone you may or may not even like, with the full expectation that not only will it happen, but that it will go well enough to generate heirs. There is pressure. There is sweat. There is a dog in the corner of the room licking its paw with unsettling focus. If you're feeling romantic, you've clearly had too much wine. But to be fair, and let's give the Middle Ages one moment of fairness here, the bedding ceremony wasn't always this intense. In some parts of Europe, it was largely symbolic. The couple would lie down together fully clothed, a priest would bless the bed, and then everyone would leave. Sometimes. Occasionally. On Tuesdays. When the stars aligned. But in many households, especially noble ones, the bedding ceremony was treated with the same seriousness as a business contract. Because that's exactly what marriage was, a contract, with land, livestock, and reputation on the line. The consummation wasn't just a personal moment. It was a political act. A legal one. If it didn't happen, the whole arrangement could be voided. So people watched. Just in case. And if you think this is an exaggeration, know that entire annulments were granted based on testimony that the marriage had failed to take root. If you were a noblewoman whose husband didn't perform, you could haul him to court. If you were a peasant, you probably just told your neighbors and hoped the shame worked faster than the clergy. You start to realize that in the medieval world, sex wasn't private because nothing was private. The body wasn't just a body. It was a tool. A statement. A source of endless documentation. And tonight, your body, exhausted, embarrassed, maybe even terrified, is expected to perform on cue, for the sake of God, family, inheritance, and gossip. So you lie down. You exhale. You wonder how many other couples have done the same thing, in the same bed, under the same sheets, while the same steward waited awkwardly outside holding a basin of wine. And you pray, not for love, or even for pleasure, but for the simple hope that no one knocks before morning. Let's say, somehow, you got through the wedding, the ceremony, the public undressing, the sheepish eye contact with your mother-in-law, and whatever awkward fumbling followed once the last observer finally shut the door. You did it. It's done. And yet, you're still not sure if you sinned. Because in the medieval world, just having sex isn't what matters. It's how you had it, when you had it, why you had it, and most importantly, whether it checked the church's long, exhausting list of divine conditions. It's not enough to be married. No, that's just your entry ticket. Now you have to worry about things like position, intent, emotion, day of the week, and whether your thoughts lingered even briefly on pleasure. Because apparently, even joy has a risk assessment form. You're told that the correct way to have sex is modestly, quickly, and without enthusiasm. The preferred position is missionary, not because it's romantic or even efficient, but because it's natural and therefore less likely to offend the Almighty. Any variation could invite suspicion. Any sign of excitement might suggest you're enjoying yourself a little too much for someone who's just trying to make a baby. And make no mistake, Procreation is the only acceptable reason to do this. Passion? Sin. Lust? Sin. Curiosity? Big sin. Trying something fun you heard about from your cousin who went to the south of France once? Sin with a side of excommunication. You begin to internalize this. Even the most routine act becomes a kind of silent confession. Did you think impure thoughts? Did you feel a moment of pleasure? Did you initiate, instead of waiting for your husband to awkwardly signal his interest by removing one sock and coughing in your direction? Better bring it up in confession. Because your priest might ask. And he won't do it gently. Confessors in this period were equipped with manuals, entire books, full of very specific questions. And they weren't shy about using them. Did you lie with your husband during Advent? Did you experience desire? Did you move your hips? Yes. That one's in there. Some priests became so fixated on rooting out illicit passion that they'd interrogate parishioners about their nighttime habits, their daydreams, even their posture. You start to wonder if they're doing research for a future sermon or just taking notes for a particularly strange personal diary. And if you think the church's rules were hard to follow, try remembering when you're even allowed to have sex. Because certain days are off limits. Lots of them, actually. You're not supposed to have sex on Sundays, obviously, that's the Lord's Day. But also not on Wednesdays, the day Judas plotted against Christ, or Fridays, the day he was crucified. Saturdays are dicey. And then there are feast days, fast days, holy days, the entire 40 days of Lent, the entire 40 days of Advent, and sometimes even periods surrounding saints' festivals. At one point, one historian noted that only about 1/3 of the calendar was technically safe for marital intimacy. And even then, only under the right emotional and theological circumstances. So here you are, in a marriage that probably wasn't your choice, trying to fulfill your conjugal duties in a room with thin walls, wondering if last night's performance qualified as both legal and liturgically acceptable, and there's a real possibility the answer is no. Of course, some people broke the rules. A lot of them, actually. Especially peasants. When survival is your main concern, you don't stop to check if it's St. Eustace's feast day. But nobles? Clergy? Wealthy merchants with reputations to manage? They followed the rules. Or at least said they did. Publicly. This creates an entire generation of married couples caught between what they feel, what they want, and what the church says is spiritually safe. And if you've ever wanted to kill your libido entirely, just know that a 13th century bishop once advised couples to pray immediately after intimacy to avoid letting the devil enter through the gate of pleasure. Because apparently, Satan is just lurking outside the bedroom window like an overly enthusiastic marriage counselor with a clipboard. So you wake up, still exhausted, vaguely ashamed, and unsure whether to light a candle or just apologize to God preemptively. You go about your day pretending everything is normal, while secretly wondering whether that one gasp you made in the dark just cost you 6 days in purgatory. But don't worry, there's still the church's official stance on virginity to get to. And that's where things really get weird. By now, you've come to terms with the fact that your sex life is being managed by clergy, monitored by in-laws, and whispered about by kitchen maids. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the psychological minefield that is virginity. Because in the medieval world, your worth as a woman doesn't begin with your name, your skill, or your sense of humor. It begins, and often ends, with whether or not your hymen is intact. Which is funny, in a tragic, scream into a pillow sort of way, because even medieval medical texts were confused about what the hymen actually was. Some believed it was a physical seal, like the cork on a bottle of sin. Others thought it was more symbolic, a spiritual membrane that would only rupture for the right man, on the right night, under church supervision, presumably while Gregorian chants played in the distance. Either way, it had to break. And preferably, bleed. Because no one in this time period had yet figured out that bodies aren't all built like fairy tale props. So how do they prove virginity? Simple. They check the sheets. After the wedding night, someone, usually a servant, sometimes a priest, occasionally an entire delegation of older women who all look like they knit moral superiority into their shawls, inspects the bedding for blood. No blood? Scandal. Accusations. Whispers about impurity. Entire annulments have been filed over a suspiciously clean piece of linen. Never mind that half the population doesn't bleed at all, or that nerves and dryness and candlelit performance anxiety can all interfere with the script. Science doesn't matter. The story does. In some noble households, the bedsheets are held up the next morning like a trophy. Like evidence. Like the physical receipt of a transaction completed. In certain regions of France and England, there were even official witnesses who would examine the linen and sign off on it, like some medieval version of a notary public for awkward bodily fluids. If that weren't invasive enough, there were also virginity tests for brides whose reputations were in question. These ranged from medical exams, performed by midwives or court physicians, to grotesquely symbolic rituals involving belts, rings, or even weighing the girl to see if she was still light with virtue. Because nothing says science like judging morality by scale. And here's where it gets darker. If a nobleman suspected his wife wasn't a virgin, and didn't find blood on the sheets, he could accuse her of fraud. She could be sent back to her family. Her dowry withheld. Her honor would be destroyed. The shame wasn't his for being paranoid or ignorant. It was hers for deceiving him with a body that didn't behave like a medieval pamphlet. But it wasn't just nobles. Even among peasants, a bride's value could plummet if it was rumored she wasn't untouched. That rumor alone could cancel a marriage, stain an entire family, or make the local priest give you that look, the one where he tilts his head slightly and pretends to pray extra hard when you walk past. You know the one. And yet, despite all this obsession, actual sex education was non-existent. Girls weren't told what to expect. No diagrams. No discussion. You might get a whispered warning from your older sister, or a half smirk from a midwife who'd seen too much, but most girls went into marriage with no real idea of what was about to happen, only that it was supposed to hurt, it had to bleed, and if it didn't, well, good luck explaining that to your mother-in-law, the priest, and the guy in the kitchen who definitely snoops through your laundry. Men, of course, weren't held to the same standard. A groom's sexual experience was usually seen as either irrelevant or flattering. He knows what he's doing, someone might whisper approvingly, as if sexual double standards were just another part of the marital decor, like chamber pots and poorly carved headboards. And perhaps most ironically of all, the church, while demanding purity, quietly benefited from the system. Virgin martyrs were venerated. Virgin brides were expected. And women who stayed virgins? Even better. They could become nuns, saints, or at least moral examples. Meanwhile, men could sin, confess, and reset like it was a medieval version of clearing browser history. So here you are, lying in a bed that feels more like a courtroom, with a sheet that doubles as evidence, and a body that's being judged more on myth than biology. You try to rest, but it's hard to relax when you know someone might be checking the linens before breakfast. And even harder when you realize the most intimate part of your body isn't even yours to explain, it's theirs to interpret. By now, you've noticed something strange. Outside your marriage, intimacy is everywhere. In stories, in songs, in poems dramatic enough to make a teenager cringe. Knights wander around talking about unrequited love like it's a full-time job. Troubadours write lyrics about ladies so beautiful their glances cause internal bleeding. Court life is drenched in metaphors, longing sighs, and declarations of eternal devotion, all delivered to women who are emphatically not their wives. It's called courtly love, and it's one of the great marketing schemes of the Middle Ages. The idea goes like this: a knight chooses a noblewoman, usually higher in rank, always married, and dedicates his every thought, word, and overly long poem to her. He can't touch her. He can't marry her. He may never even speak to her without blushing into his armor. But he can write 178 verses about the curve of her elbow and how her sleeve fluttered once in a breeze sent directly by God. This is not romance. It's aspirational suffering. You, on the other hand, are married to someone you might have met 3 times before the wedding. Intimacy isn't about gazes across the banquet hall, it's about livestock, land rights, and remembering whose turn it is to empty the chamber pot. While knights are out composing love ballads, you're arguing over whether to store the onions under the bed or behind the hearth. Because unlike courtly love, actual intimacy involves living with a person, and that means dealing with their smell, their mood swings, and their deeply suspicious opinion that bathing ruins a man's constitution. But somehow, despite the daily reality of medieval relationships being brutally practical, the fantasy lives on. In castles, noble women receive secret tokens, a ribbon, a carved token, sometimes a lock of hair, stolen, presumably, from someone who wasn't looking. Knights promise to fight in her name. Sometimes even die for her. It's dramatic, yes. But also safe. Because it never has to go anywhere. That's the point. Courtly love wasn't about sex, at least, not officially. It was about longing. Idealizing women in ways that made them seem powerful and unreachable, while still reinforcing the system that kept them married off like chess pieces. She could inspire a man's virtue, his loyalty, even his military service. But her actual agency? Still limited to whether she wore blue or green at the next feast. And while all this fluttering fantasy plays out in verses and ballads, you're over here trying to get pregnant before you turn 17, while keeping your children alive through another lice outbreak and explaining to your husband that maybe, just maybe, he should stop bringing his boots into bed. You begin to notice the contradiction. Women in stories are exalted, elevated, placed on pedestals so high they get altitude sickness. But women in life? Still expected to manage a household, produce heirs, stay silent, and possibly bleed on command. The knight may worship your image, but is still going to marry the girl with the biggest dowry. Or whichever cousin his father negotiated for after the last harvest. And if you think peasants were spared this emotional whiplash, think again. The stories filtered down. The ideals echoed through village festivals and wandering storytellers. Even if no one expected a love sonnet, the fantasy still clung to the edges of expectation, the idea that men should seek conquest, and women should reward them with passive affection and perfectly arched eyebrows. So here you are, caught between 2 medieval scripts, one that says love should be burning and poetic and noble, and another that says your marriage is a transaction and you should be grateful if your husband doesn't mistake your name for the cows. You try to find some middle ground, some moment where love and reality overlap. Maybe he brings you a flower that isn't half eaten by goats. Maybe you laugh together over something stupid the dog did. Maybe he learns where your shoulder ends and the blanket begins. It's not a sonnet. But it's something. And honestly, that's more than most of the knights ever got. By this point in your medieval life, you've realized privacy is a myth. Your husband snores like a dying ox, your mother-in-law critiques your porridge with suspicious regularity, and the priest is probably praying for your womb more often than you are. But even with all of that, the person who truly knows everything about you, the one who's seen your worst hair day, counted the stretch marks on your thighs, and knows exactly what happened after the last feast when the wine ran out, is your maid. Your lady's maid is the 14th century equivalent of a personal assistant, emotional support animal, hygiene technician, and walking archive of family drama, all rolled into one underpaid, overworked human being with a talent for keeping secrets, or spreading them at exactly the wrong moment. She dresses you, undresses you, and brushes your hair while you complain about things you wouldn't admit to the Virgin Mary. She's held the bucket while you vomited from nerves, tucked herbs under your mattress during your period, and kept a straight face while you tried to explain a particularly bad dream about your cousin Squire. She's the silent witness to your private breakdowns, your whispered fantasies, and the day you tried to flirt with your husband and he responded by asking if the goats had eaten yet. She also, unfortunately, has ears. and a mouth, and a direct line to the rest of the staff. Because even though she's loyal, mostly, and discreet, usually, she lives in the servant world, where gossip is currency and your bedroom mishaps are fair game after 2 mugs of ale and a long day of scrubbing linens. You once told her that your husband kissed like wet bread. The next day, the cook offered you dry toast for balance. Coincidence? Please. Ladies' maids are the hidden power players of the castle. They see everything. They hear everything. They remember everything. And unlike you, they don't answer to the priest or the steward, they answer to each other. It's a network. A secret society of women with access to noble bodies and noble secrets, trading information with the efficiency of plague rats and the elegance of a curtsy. And they know what's normal. Which is dangerous. Because if your marriage isn't going well, if your husband's gone too often, or not often enough, if the bed's been strangely quiet, or suspiciously loud, your maid knows. And she's filing it away. Maybe to protect you. Maybe to help you. Or maybe just to entertain herself on laundry day when the soap runs out and the gossip is all that's left to scrub. She also knows about other women. Who visits. Who stays late. Which chamber pots have 2 sets of footprints leading out the door. She knows when the steward's niece suddenly has a new necklace, and when the stable boy has that guilty glow that only comes from kissing someone very above his station. And she knows if you know. And she knows if you're pretending not to know. It's exhausting. And yet, she's also your closest confidant. Because when things go wrong, when your husband forgets your name, when the church sermon sounds like it was written personally about your last Tuesday, she's there. Holding your corset while you cry. Telling you you're not crazy. Slipping herbs into your tea that might calm your nerves or just make you slightly less interested in punching the bishop. You depend on her. And she depends on you. You are both women in a world that monitors your behavior more than it monitors the actual quality of the roads. And that bond, forged through sweat, whispered sarcasm, and shared despair over men who can't find the laundry basket, is stronger than most of the marriage vows you've seen performed. But still, you keep your voice low. Just in case. Because tomorrow, when she's helping the kitchen maid fold linens or fetching something from the cellar, she might need to pay for a favor. Or a rumor. And your name might come up, purely in passing, completely innocent, while someone slices carrots and raises an eyebrow. So when you speak softly. And when you vent, you offer her a plum first. Because she may know everything about you. But you'll never know how much she tells. You'd think, given how much courtly poetry talks about passion and longing and stolen glances, that a medieval castle might provide a halfway decent setting for some romantic privacy. You know, heavy curtains, flickering candles, a carved canopy bed, maybe a breeze wafting in through a tower window. Instead, what you've got is a room that smells like damp wool, echoes like a public bathhouse, and feels like someone tried to build a love nest out of sharp rocks and disappointment. Because castle architecture? Not exactly optimized for seduction. First of all, let's talk about walls. Stone. Thick, cold, slightly clammy. They don't just suck the heat out of the room, they suck the mood out too. There's no such thing as an intimate whisper in a medieval chamber. The acoustics are so bad that a cough on the 2nd floor can be heard 3 stories down, and if you so much as sigh suggestively, it echoes into the great hall like an accidental performance. Which is great if you wanted to share the experience with your in-laws, the kitchen staff, and a passing monk. Not so great if you were hoping to be subtle. Then there's the furniture. That glorious bed you imagined with the velvet drapes and rose petals? Try a lumpy mattress stuffed with straw and regret, balanced on a wooden frame that squeaks louder than a confession. Every movement becomes a declaration. You can't roll over without announcing it to the entire castle. And God help you if you try anything ambitious, the bed will protest so violently, it might require structural reinforcement or divine intervention. And that's assuming you have a bed to yourself. More likely, you're sharing it. Not with your lover, with your household. Because in many medieval settings, especially among the not super rich, communal sleeping was just normal. Servants, siblings, cousins, maybe the occasional noble guest, all piled together like human lasagna. You might be trying to explore your marital privileges while someone 3 feet away dreams aggressively about stew. There's no sexy slow build-up. Just the constant awareness that your intimacy has an audience, and one of them is snoring. Let's not forget the floors. Hardwood, if you're lucky. Loose planks over cold stone if you're not. Either way, they creak. Not in a romantic old house way. In a the floor just tattled on you kind of way. Every step you take is a noise complaint waiting to happen. Want to sneak off for a late night rendezvous? Good luck with that. You'll wake the dog, the guard, the lady's maid, and possibly the ancestral spirits. Medieval castles were about defense and authority, not ambience. Privacy was for ghosts and aristocrats with separate towers. Even the lighting is working against you. There's no dimmer switch. Just fire. Smoky, flickering, unreliable fire. Candles sputter. Torches crackle. Everything casts shadows that make your partner look like a villain in a morality play. Nothing says I'm in the mood like being lit from below like a tax collector in purgatory. And if your torch goes out mid-session? You better know where the chamber pot is, or things are going to get even more medieval. And speaking of chamber pots, yes. They're in the room. Sometimes tucked under the bed. Sometimes in full view. Because nothing stirs the loins quite like the gentle aroma of shared digestion. Let's be clear, the castle wasn't built for comfort. It was built to withstand sieges. To impress visitors. To say, I own land and possibly a small militia. Romance was an afterthought, somewhere between keep the tapestries from molding and don't let the roof cave in this winter. And yet, somehow, people made it work. Maybe they slipped away into the stables. Maybe they found a quiet corner of the chapel and asked for forgiveness afterward. Maybe they whispered things into each other's ears while pretending to discuss wool prices. Whatever it wasn't thanks to the architecture. If anything, the stone walls and creaking would just made every stolen moment feel more urgent, more fragile, more ridiculous. Because when your bed sounds like it's collapsing under moral pressure, and the candlelight is doing you no favors, and someone might be listening outside the door with a piece of tin for better acoustics, it takes a special kind of commitment to make love anyway. Or at least, a really bad sense of timing. So now you know. It wasn't candlelight and corsets and stolen kisses in moonlit towers. It was straw in your sheets, priests in your business, floorboards that squeak like tattletales, and an audience, always an audience. It was sex as duty, love as theory, and privacy as a luxury reserved for saints and the terminally uninteresting. You were judged by your silence, your womb, and your ability to keep your scandal down to a whisper. You were watched by servants, monitored by neighbors, micromanaged by the church, and serenaded by knights who wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real relationship. And all of it, every sigh, every rule, every candle stub and choreographed bedding ceremony, was dressed up as virtue. And yet, people still found a way. To touch, to flirt, to sneak, to hope. There were women who passed love notes under bread loaves. Men who carved names into trees. Midwives who quietly shared herbs they weren't supposed to know about. Servants who covered for their mistresses. And castle halls where, despite the cold and the creaking and the expectations, someone, somewhere, managed to feel chosen, if only for a night. So if you're lying there in bed tonight, listening to your own creaking floors or someone else's snoring, remember, sex in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic. It wasn't sacred. It wasn't easy. But it was human. Messy, absurd, awkward, tender. And very, very real. If you're still awake, thank you for staying. And if you've already drifted off somewhere between the communal chamber pot and the lady's maid who knows too much, I hope your dreams are private. Good night.